In this section, we will focus on systematic reviews. Where are systematic reviews located on the evidence pyramid? We are at the very top. Now let's look at reviews in general. There are different types of reviews. Probably the most common ones are narrative reviews. This is just a broad perspective on a topic, and there is no specific research search strategy. This can contain significant bias and may not contain an evaluation of the quality of the evidence of different studies. The search and the types of studies that are included may be dependent on the author's preferences. Structured reviews are somewhere in between the systematic reviews and the narrative reviews. They do have some structure, but is limited. They're possibly less biased than narrative reviews, but they're not comprehensive, and they do evaluate the quality of the evidence. So this can be considered like a partial systematic review. The systematic reviews are the ones that are perhaps you find less common, although they are becoming more and more common. They are comprehensive. They evaluate the quality of the evidence using specific guidelines. And the reviews may be either based on randomized clinical trials or can also be based on any other trial, on any other type of design, such as case control studies. And lastly, meta-analyses are a quantitative systematic reviews that apply a systematic, like a statistical analysis. So you perform first a systematic review, and then you take all of the studies that remain in your systematic review, and you may pull the results together into a meta-analysis. So you add an additional statistical analysis to the systematic review. There are well-defined steps to conduct systematic reviews. First, you design it like any other study. You want to have a very clear research question. Then you define your eligibility criteria. And essentially what this does is that defines your sample and the target population. Keep in mind, though, that we're talking about studies, not people. So the sample is the sample of studies. The eligibility criteria is what are the eligibility criteria for your studies. Then you define the study selection methods and the time. If these were people, then it would be equivalent to defining your recruitment strategy. So how do you define your study selection methods is you also give information about which databases you're going to be looking for. Typically, you want at least two, for example, PubMed and Embase. And also you will describe exactly where you're going to be looking for these studies. For example, besides the major databases, will you be looking at gray literature or studies that maybe have not been published, but you might still be able to find through your searches. And also you define the time. So something that perhaps you could consider is if there really is a systematic review on the topic that you chose, you might want to take a look at the systematic review. If it was well done, then you might want to start your systematic review after the previous one. If that systematic review was not well done, then you might just go ahead and use a different time period. And the time is essentially the time that the studies were published. Then you do the data collection. So the data collection is not a data collection on people, but again, data collection on studies. So you're going to identify the studies. You're going to select the ones that would be included. The ones that are selected based on your eligibility criteria then will be assessed for quality. And then you will also extract the data. For these processes, you typically have at least a couple of individuals in the team working on this independently and then comparing results, and maybe adding a third person in case there is a discrepancy. The process is highly standardized. For example, to extract data from the studies, you would use standardized data collection forms. And also to assess study quality, there are a number of checklists and guidelines that you would follow. Once you have identified the studies, then you might do an analysis that becomes a meta-analysis. And but otherwise, even if you without a statistical analysis, you may still review the results and then present your results and conclusions. This process can be long. I mean, with many of the reviews, systematic reviews that have been involved they've taken approximately 1.5 to 2 years. And by that time, you're ready to publish and to submit to a journal, and your review might be old. So usually you want to check again right before you submit to make sure that and update your search and the studies. And you might find that other studies have been published while you were working on your review. So we were working on a review, on a systematic review using case control studies. And we were interested in looking at epigenetic changes in association with low birth weight. We were particularly interested in looking at the insulin-like growth factor pathway, the IGF pathway. And this was one of the many studies that we identified. There was sometimes you might start with thousands of studies. One of the most recent studies, we actually started with 6,000 studies. And we worked with the librarian to define the keywords, and then we identify the studies, usually coming from at least a couple of databases. Then the question is, how do we sort through these studies? So one could be just saying, well, we're going to first look just at the titles, or perhaps the titles and the abstracts, or the full text. So there are different levels of scrutiny that you can utilize. I particularly like to do both, at least minimum, the title and abstract. It's not much more time to look at the title and abstract than just to looking at the title alone. And here I'll give you an example. This study, when you look at the title, would you include this study in your systematic review of case control studies? And after you decide whether you would have liked to include it or not, take a look at the abstract and then decide. And feel free to discuss this among yourselves. Here is another example, and so this one is on it's a review. What type of review is this? When you look at the beginning, it says evidence-based analysis. So you might think, okay, maybe there may be a meta-analysis. But the way the article starts is that first of all, you see already there is only one author. And typically for systematic reviews, you need the full team, because you need individuals that are independent of each other, that then assess the evidence, assess the studies, the eligibility, and then you also want to include the librarian. So already the fact that there is one individual, you might decide that this will definitely not be as structured as appropriate of a review. In addition, you see that the decision to select studies is not very clear. This one starts with the history of dental restorations and goes on. And at the end, like in this, you can take a look at this in detail, but you will not find any type of methodology. So if you decided to reproduce the results of this study, and you just said the title, and then you went ahead, or there is actually no methodology section, then you will not be able to reproduce it. So this one is a narrative review.